Humility. Greatness and humility. They don't sound like they go together, but I promise you, you can't have one without the other one. If you do have it, it won't last very long. One of the greatest men that I've ever read about, or that you know, or that you heard about, is George Washington. One of the greatest things George Washington did is when they were at Valley Forge in that winter where their feet froze, they had no clothes, they had no food, they were starving to death. George Washington lived in a tent. He walked amongst the men. He didn't have a fancy headquarters house with wood-burning stove and so forth. He lived like they did. He was humble. And that's what made him loved by his troops and loved by the American people. One day the rider comes along and he sees these soldiers trying to move this big log. And there's a corporal there that's in charge of these men. And the rider comes up and says, how come you're not helping? And the corporal says, I'm the boss. I'm the one that gives the orders. I'm the boss. The rider said, okay. So he gets off his horse and he goes over there and he helps those guys and they get the log moved. And the corporal comes over and he says, thank you, sir. And the guy says, that's not any problem. If you ever need to do something like this again, just give me a call. I'm George Washington. Well, how do you think the corporal felt? How do you think those soldiers felt about the corporal and the commander-in-chief? I mean, there's a great difference. One time Washington was out with a group of friends. This is actually during the Revolutionary War, and he was with a group of people that were on a committee, a Senate committee, and they were out riding, and in order to get where they needed to get to, they had to jump over a fence. Well, when they jumped over the fence, they knocked some of the stones off the fence. And Washington said, we need to fix that. And they said, oh, leave it alone, the farmer can do that. And so they went and finished their ride. George Washington came back and put the stones back on the fence. And the guy that came back with him, his aide, he said, Your Excellency, you're too big to be fixing fence. And Washington says, no, I'm just the right size. Do you understand how George Washington is thought of to be the greatest? You see, George Washington could have been King George. When they won the war, there was a very high demand for him to become the King of America. And George said, we just fought a war to not have a king. And he was president for 8 years, 2 terms. And he's the one that started the idea of presidents serving 2 terms. Because at the end of that second term, he could have been president for life. And he said, no, it's somebody else's turn. Some of the congressmen today ought to listen to George. I mean, term limits. I mean, George is the first one, and you wonder why George Washington is thought of today as the father of the country. You don't achieve the greatness without the humility, and that's what he did. George Washington was truly the greatest American because he may well have been the humblest of the Americans. To be the best you that you're going to be, you're going to have to develop the quality of humility.